Honey, I blew up the business.
Welcome to the podcast. We've got Paul Archer here today. Great to see you, Paul.
Hi, Dan. How's it going?
Very well indeed. I'm super excited to speak to you because not only is Paul the founder and CEO of Duel, a brand advocacy platform, he's a bit of a man about the world. He's a record-breaking adventurer, or should I say misadventurer. We'll get into his entrepreneurial career, but he's the best-selling author of a book called It's on the Meter: One Taxi, Three Mates, and 43,000 Miles of Misadventures Around the World, which is a fantastic sort of story, which we perhaps will get into. He's also a podcaster with his Building Brand Advocacy podcast and speaks regularly at events all over the world, including TEDx, Cannes Lions, Social Media Week, and more. And guest lectures at the British School of Fashion. Check it out. Look at his illustrious career. And I'm excited because I did a bit of backpacking when I was little and I set up a business and it felt like a similar sort of adventure. And so I find a kindred spirit in having adventures through entrepreneurship. But before we get into the interview, I want to remind everybody that this podcast is brought to you by my company, The Tech Department, the one I blew up back in 2017. But we did turn it around, and these dudes are thankfully funding this great experiment in speaking to people about what it's really like being an entrepreneur. And so if you like what we're doing and you get value from it, please rate us on Apple Podcasts and share it with your mates, because we're trying to do a good thing here by building on what was my worst experience in business. And so learning from speaking to people like Paul and helping you on your entrepreneurial journey. So give us a rating, 5 stars only. Thank you. So I want to get into it, but what I'm curious about is, so Paul had this year or 15 months perhaps, breaking records around the world in a London black cab. And he got back, I believe, in sort of 2012, was it?
Something like that, yeah. May 2012, yeah.
So you got back from this amazing adventure, and that was May 2012. And in November 2012, I believe, you launched a business called Daredevil Project, or circa 6 months later. Now, what I'm interested in, because having done a bit of traveling and then come back, can you give us a quick sketch of what happened on your taxi adventure? But I'm interested to know what was happening in your life in that 6-month period between crazy adventure and launching a startup.
Mainly realizing that I'm wholly unemployable, I think, was probably the main takeaway from that period. So back when I was at university with a couple of buddies of mine in a pub after a couple of beers, we thought it would be hilariously funny to try and break the world record for the longest ever taxi journey. We tried to drive from London to Sydney in a black cab, which we bought on eBay for about 1,300 quid, which was the first error. You shouldn't buy a 25-year-old car on eBay without really looking into any of those kind of things. But again, mainly it came because we'd had a couple of drinks. We thought that would be funny. And then we got a big black marker and mapped the longest route possible on a map, because that's what all good taxi drivers do to rack up the fare. And then spent a bit of time trying to find some people who would sponsor us and basically turn the car into a sort of a rally car with stickers of other sponsors who'd give us free stuff and actually maybe give some cash towards the trip, and then sort of set off on this expedition back in, I think it was February 2011 when we sort of set off. So we graduated uni the previous year, got a real job in the city, and then quit that very, very soon to go adventuring. It was only supposed to take 6 months, but it got kind of wildly out of hand.
Wow. So you got back in, so you started a career in the city, realized you were sort of probably unemployable at the core, and then built on your unemployability by going through this 15-month crazy adventure. People should check it out, by the way. Let's not get too into the sort of details of it, but it's crazy, the adventure. So you land back in sort of May 2012, and you've had this crazy adventure, and you've managed to park the black cab and wave it goodbye and never want to go near a black cab again.
Never want to see that again. Yep. Absolutely.
And so what happened? What happened then? Because you've obviously got the rest of your life to deal with, and you've just had this amazing thing. You suddenly land back in the UK, and reality's biting.
Well, it was a really interesting time because I thought it never occurred to me previously, not something I was 10-year-old dreaming of, that I could become a professional adventurer and I could go on more and more ridiculous adventures and write books about them and do speaking gigs and try and make TV shows about it. And so during that six month period of time, I was trying to pen this book. thinking of another wild adventure that would get lots of press attention, and making a pilot with the BBC they were trying to make a follow-up to Top Gear, basically, and found a couple of stupid young kids who would drive a car-based adventures and get into all sorts of scrapes, which we had historically got into. So basically that was the whole thing. And I was like, this is it. This is my career. I'm going to be a professional adventurer. And then BBC very unceremoniously dropped us after we made the pilot, never made anything else from there, dropped our publishing deal. I found myself picking up the odd speaking gig and chatting to other adventurers at them and realizing that my a fantastic career path basically involved me spending most of my life in a tent with wet feet. And it just felt that actually, I think the most important thing that kind of took away from it is that the taxi trip was amazing. You know, we'd managed to break a couple of world records. We drove around the world. We had managed to get on the front page of the Wall Street Journal and every other press thing. We would never, ever top that. So everything I did after that would always be a little bit worse and a little bit sort of like flogging a dead horse. And I realized that actually there was another adventure that could be found. And for me, that adventure was in building things. I'd always built software since I was a kid. I took a year and a half out at uni before the trip to be the first employee at a SaaS company. And so I'd had this wild idea that I could organize events where I would set challenges for people, basically over road trips or stag do weekends, and they'd all have to come up with the most creative solutions to these one-word challenges. And that was Daredevil Project. And sort of started organizing these events all around the country with stag do's and corporate events on a bit more of the wild side, corporate events. And it was fun while it lasted. And but it was guaranteed that someone was going to hurt themselves, and it was really quite an immature way to be spending these things. I think I was still half in my uni days in my head about doing these events and challenges, and basically what kind of came from it is I built some software to support the events that we were running, just to make my life a lot easier. And someone picked up on it and offered to invest. And at the time, you know, the events weren't doing that well. I was living in a bike shed at my mate's house, literally underneath the bikes on a mattress. I had no money. And basically they were like, we'll give you some money to try and turn this into a high growth tech business. And I was like, well, it's obviously not going to be a high growth tech business. This is a stupid idea, but I'll take your money so I can pay my rent and keep myself fed for the next few months. And basically from that went into the part of the money was I went into an incubator to try and evolve those ideas from it. And actually I was like, well, this idea is actually a bit crap for a tech business, but I do have another idea, which is for a couple of apps. And so we sort of evolved that, met my co-founder, Neo, into more of a studio. And so we're building different apps, one of which, Challenge Off, we managed to raise some venture capital funding, and it was basically going to be effectively a Snapchat killer. We were guaranteed to become, billion users, take over the world, all of this stuff. And as you probably have noticed, that never happened. And that ended up falling very hard, flat on its face, which ended up being the end of the Daredevil Project adventures, because we had thought that we were going to become big in the entire world, but in particular we had a deal with Apple, who was going to distribute us. We were going to take it to China at launch. We were basically, this is it. We were absolutely made, and we're sat there on a boat in Bristol, which is where we were based. They were very excited, champagne's on ice. We're like, oh, it's going to go live. We're going to be the front page of the App Store recommended, which means that you're made, you're anointed from up on high, and this is it. We're waiting for it, or kept pressing refresh, and then we just started seeing these things pop up in Turkey. And we're like, hang on a sec, we're not doing anything in Turkey, but nothing in America, and nothing in the UK. And it realized that they did feature us, but they featured us in Turkey for a period of time, which ended up meaning we got kind of relatively big-ish. Like a lot of people downloaded it in Turkey, and then stopped using it and didn't share it. And effectively the product was fun for a little bit, but it wasn't that fun that you told all your mates. And the kind of fundamentals, like core to an app and core to any business, is that you have to have received such a remarkable experience from it that you feel compelled to remark upon it and tell other people. And that advocacy is what's baked into it. And that is what every great app that you have in your pocket has, that you introduce people. You've probably told 1,000 people about different apps that you use at any given time. And we just did not have that. And it basically fell flat on its face. And it never to see the light of day again.
Wow. So that was a bit of a moment in time, sat with your champagne on ice. Did you still drink the champagne?
Oh, yeah, we got absolutely battered. Yeah. In misery, had nothing. That was it. We knew that was the last sort of hurrah of it. The funding was all based on this we basically had the ability to gamble, put everything on red, or put it on black. And we just went all in on it. And
oh my God, the sad trumpet noise sounds on the boat in Bristol.
Very much so.
And
yeah.
the half deflated balloons and the warm champagne. So I want to get a picture of you. You had this kind of student life that had some entrepreneurial stuff in there. You kind of took that year or so off to sort of get into that SaaS product. And you went off and had this adventure, which again ultimately becomes a book and an amazing kind of story to tell. And then you're into this, you said you kind of went into the Daredevil project almost still in student, perhaps cultural mode. You know, you're still thinking like a student. It's a bit reckless. It's sort of shooting from the hip, perhaps. It's sort of rough and tumble. You're trying to eat for the next 3 months or whatever it is. And I might come back to this sort of moment on the boat thing, but looking back now, that sort of, because we all go through a period of, call it maturity over time, but particularly as entrepreneurs, what do you see you kind of, if you had like you today speaking to you back in 2012 or 2013, sort of in that Daredevil project, what would you be advising sort of younger Paul?
Get a real job, maybe. It was a fair few years in the doldrums, living hand to mouth and desperately trying to make a business that was never really destined to succeed, because it wasn't that we were trying to solve a big problem that we knew where the answer was. We knew the industry. It was like, oh, maybe this will work a little bit like this. And I think that what was valuable, the most valuable experience that I've had was those first few years that I took working for that SaaS company, Grad Intel, who became very successful and supports the majority of the students in the country. And that learning that I had, I was lucky enough to be working with the managing director, who's one of the best salesmen I've ever seen, and just watched him. And then we would drive off to these client meetings, and then 2-3 hours away, and then we'd have 3 hours of a drive back, and we would that 1 hour meeting would be completely broken apart. What did that person think? What's that person? What's their role? What's their motivations? Why were they having blockers? And the learning that I got from that was just so accelerated at a very, very early age. I was 19, 20. And I've taken that to today. And I think that there is a tendency for a lot of students. There's this idea of starting businesses it's quite sexy these days. It's like, what do you want to be when you grow up? I want to start a business. I mean, it's far from it, as you well know. But one of the things is that a lot of students, I get the impression they get pushed by entrepreneurial societies and things like that to start businesses straight out of uni. And actually, I just didn't have the maturity to be able to start a good business at that time. And I think that had I gone and worked with another entrepreneur, watched what they were doing, got into an industry, it really figured out where there were problems to be solved, that would have been probably a far better use of my time in those early days. Because the thing is, I believe that that entrepreneurial spark is in you, right? You can't want to be an entrepreneur. Like, God knows why anyone would want to be one. It's not a particularly great mindset that you have, because it means that you're flitting and flighting, you're kind of jumping on various different things, and you can't almost help being an entrepreneur in many different ways. And I think that is always going to be within you, and actually it will come out. So whether that happens like a year later, as soon as you start doing it, or whether it comes 3 years or 5 years later, you will end up doing what you want to do, but you'll be in a really good foundation. And I think that's something that I wish I'd done.
That's a really very astute observation, actually. And I think it's funny because, for what it's worth, I've only ever worked in startups. Like, my first job was in a startup, and then I went to work in another startup, and then I left that to set up a startup back in 2001. The point being is the first, I think it's 3 years, maybe 4 years of my career was learning. it was actually kind of like working with a mentor or mentors, positive and negative, like what worked or what didn't work, or what was good people, bad people. And funnily enough, I'm reading a book at the moment by a guy called Robert Greene, who wrote the 48 Laws of Power. This book called Mastery. And it's about how you become a master in your particular domain. And it's a whole section about working with being a good mentee or having a mentor and learning from, which is kind of what you're saying. Anyway, but yes, I think something really in that, kind of learning, because that creative force is in you, and learning before you do things. Okay, so we've got this period where you would have taken a pause before getting into that first business, learned, worked with some people, seen a bit more of things. But let's go back to this boat. So you're on this boat, and the wah, wah, wah sounds just played, and you're sort of looking at your shoes. What was in your kind of heart in that moment?
That was the moment when I realized that it wasn't going to work. I think that often you have I think there's a bit of self-talk that you've pushed down. And you're like, oh, I don't know if this is as good as I keep telling people it is. And you think maybe it's not, but you push that away, right? You can't have that. You got to get there. And then in that moment there, it was like, it all came flooding in. It was like, this isn't what I thought it would be. And this is all what I wanted it to be. And it just basically became very clear that business would not succeed in the way that I hoped it would. In that moment, just there and then, just as soon as that thing, I allowed the honesty to kind of come out, and all of those sort of true feelings that I had actually came to a head then. And it was a pretty devastating moment, but also a really formative one, because the idea for what I do today actually came that weekend, and like it started to sort of grow from there.
Yeah, interesting. It's a bit like the pressure. Do you think you were kind of telling yourself, I hesitate to say this, but bullshitting, but almost like telling yourself, yeah, it's going to be fine, and that kind of, and I relate to this, by the way, that kind of almost self-hype, it keeps you going, but it's somewhere in your gut, in your cells, you really just like, yeah, I'm not sure this is really going to work. Is that kind of what was happening for you?
Yeah, I think if you're running a business, you have a relatively unique position because you see from all different sides. The larger the business it is, the more unique your position is, because you can pull in and simulate information from marketing, from sales, from tech, from product, from conversations, from investors. And often you have to make those gut calls. And I think a bit of that data was emerging from our beta experiment, from conversations, from these various different things. And yeah, you have to figure out which parts of that self-doubt you should listen to, and which parts are just irrelevant things that everyone has, and understanding how much of that is there. And I think that often we are slow to make hard decisions. Anyone who's had to fire someone will almost inevitably say, well, I wish I did that two months ago because I knew them. And that's certainly been the way for me. And I believe that's probably the case with most people, or any kind of something like that. And I think kind of firing your own company and your own product is very similar to that. And that's not to say that I didn't then drag it out for a bunch of months after that, but that moment was when it was clear to me.
Wow. Yeah. Okay. So and there's this moment of clarity in this weekend where the seed of the idea that became what you're doing now happened. Again, I can relate to that, because back in 2017, I had this, when it was really, really like, just there was money emptying from everywhere out of my business. I had a clarity in that moment, which is now the seed of what we're doing now. All the core value proposition came from that insight. And I genuinely don't think that without the pressure of that moment, or the brute, all the good bullshit was stripped away, and it was just like, well, I can't kid myself. My ego can't tell me I'm brilliant, because it just isn't. So if I answer honestly why it's not working, then that's probably the right alternative path, or an alternative path at least.
I think that's the case. And in a moment like that, I completely agree and definitely empathize on that. And because yes, when it's like, oh, maybe this business isn't the right business, or this product isn't the right product, or it's not doing what it needs to do. It's at those moments of crises that actually the most important things happen. And I think, and I sort of said, there's obviously this recession coming. Someone said something very profound to me once, which is never let a good crisis go to waste. Because actually it's those times when your back's against the wall, when you have to innovate, when you have to really figure out what is the most important thing, bar none. and just double down on those things, that you then sort of find a new realization. And I've seen that happen in multiple times of, cash running out or COVID and various things like that. And I believe that they are those powerful moments that we often need as humans and as teams, as much as it is from a leader's position, to be like, this is what's going on. Let's refocus. What is it that we don't need to do? It's like, oh yeah, that thing there we spent, tons of time doing. You've got that sunk cost fallacy that, we invested the last 2 years doing that kind of thing. And you realize in the crisis, you go, well, that's got to die. And you get rid of that. And what else is really interesting? There's something else. And you follow that and you double down on that. And that's actually quite similar to what happened after that boat moment. Was just like, there was something there that's led on to the business that then became more successful.
Yeah, it's interesting. I was actually speaking to I had a podcast interview yesterday with a lady called Jodie Rogers, who's got a book called Hidden Edge about mental fitness. And she was sort of talking about, it's about how you respond to events, right? Pandemics, cash flow shortages, not getting listed on Apple. And you kind of, obviously there's a fear response and an emotional response that's quite primal, and how you can coach yourself to be mentally fit to be ahead of that. So you're kind of able to cope with that. And I think particularly on this point, like in the moment of crisis, there's an urge to run away. That's a fight or flight or freeze. You can kind of, but what often isn't happening is a kind of pause and clarity and reflection, and then leaning into that, right? And I think I think that's something really interesting, and just to sort of tease that out is in moments of where it's going, call it wrong, or you're expecting it to. It's quite easy to get your emotional state or hyper, and then you miss, as you said, the real true path to take.
Completely agree. And those forcing functions are great. And I don't know how to actively seek them out. I think they often happen to us, and they are very uncomfortable to go through, but we're always better, always stronger, because at the other end of it, you very rarely look back at something when it's a really hard time. And I think that so many people will be looking at some very tough times over the next year or so. Actually, what does this mean? Does it mean that business that won't make it through would have never made it through anyway, and now you're finally able to look at that? Or maybe it's a case of, well, maybe it's not all those other things that we spend our time doing, but it's this one thing that really works, and you can double down on that.
No, it's good. It's exactly that. And it's hard, that practice, because who wants things to go wrong? You don't want it, and it's very painful, and that uncertainty is part of the price of the entrepreneurial path.
And the other thing is, you never get any good stories when everything goes to plan.
Exactly that. So you can't. What are you going to talk about on podcasts? You know what I mean? If it doesn't go to hell in a handbasket one time. Yeah, no. So we've got this product that came out of that business, sort of failed spectacularly, and you had that seed of this idea. So what happened after that? So what happened to this seed of an idea?
Well, what it was, as I was saying, abundantly clear, was that the advocacy wasn't there. And I have, because basically in the taxi trip, we'd managed to raise a lot of sponsorship and got a lot of coverage for it. This is very nascent sort of days of the internet, not the internet, sorry, of social. It wasn't that long ago, when there was never a word of an influencer or anything like that. That term had never been turned, but we had a decent audience. We had sort of hundreds of thousands of people reading our blogs and sort of a decent social following. And we had managed to get them that exposure. So subsequently, I'd been working with and advising sort of CMOs and various things about how they can work with their brand ambassadors. And so I had been working with brands consistently through that time, mainly to make ends meet when my other business wasn't doing very well. But that sort of combined with a knowledge of chatting to these brands and chatting to some agencies about the audience that we were building through the app, realized that fundamentally there was something really awry with the way that marketing was being done, in that the vast majority of time, effort, and most importantly money that marketing teams spend was being spent on ads, being spent on performance ads, Facebook and Google, but also other ads like promoting it. And I knew that, particularly through the app side of things, because we were building games, we were using gamification to get people hooked in. We're looking, and so we knew to the science with spreadsheets where, if you convert from the moment you land onto it to then enter a bit of data, to then have a bit of an engagement moment, to then put your email in, and then, right, we've got you. And then day 1, day 7, day 30, all of these things is an absolute science when it comes to developing apps and developing games. And it all leads to this one thing, which is the K factor, this virality. Now, a term which is now a bit more familiar since the pandemic, but the idea that if I give it to one person, and that one person, it's called R when it's talking from that perspective, but one person tells more than themselves. Maybe it's 1.2 or even 2 or 5. It means for every one person who downloads it, they tell 5 more people. That is an exponential growth curve of advocacy. And that is what means you've got a successful product and game, and the best games and apps you've ever used will have that. And so we had all this knowledge, and then we're chatting to, some of the biggest brands in the world and talking to them, and realizing that they had no understanding of this. And in fact, the idea of, well, how much time do you spend investing in making sure that people talk about it? And it just never popped up. And actually, I know, as I'm sure you do and everyone else, like, the reason we buy the majority of our products is because somebody has recommended it. A friend that we highly trust, or maybe someone we follow, someone like a great podcaster, for example. But one of those, it could be someone on social, it could be anyway, but we select to follow them, or we select to be friends with them or family with them. And therefore we trust their opinion, and they say, well, I use this. And if we believe it's authentic, and that's fundamentally key, then we go off and we buy it. And so that is why the majority of purchases happen. It's over 80% of them. Yet the vast majority of marketing budgets are spent on ads, and I'm very rarely invested in this advocacy piece. So the premise was, if we could make investing in growing and scaling advocacy for your brand, brand advocacy, as predictable as buying a Facebook ad, then we'd have sort of shifted the table. And actually at the time, Facebook, I think Trump had just been elected in, Brexit had just happened. The idea of taking a chunk out of Zuckerberg's empire felt like quite a noble thing for us to be spending our time to be doing. And we're like, now that's a big problem that's really interesting to try and solve. And that's what we set about trying to fix.
Yeah, interesting. So you've got this kind of newfound focus and purpose, and you've got this. So how long did the first business sort of carry on for? About, you say it happened for several months, and then this new thing was that a new business that emerged out of that?
We actually didn't. We had a bit of cash in the bank from the investment, and so we should have closed it down. But the VC said, well, you'll come up with something. Why don't you spend that? I didn't realize it's actually very hard to give back EIS funds. If you find yourself doing this, you should absolutely kill the old business, start afresh, raise SEIS. It's so easy to do. So we ended up having a horrible cap table going forward. But it was the same business, but everyone had gone. So one of the co-founders left. It was just me and Neo, and one of our friends, Pete, who's a lead developer and still is today. And the three of us sort of set about trying to figure out this problem. And we took a name that we had a great Twitter handle for, and we were going to switch the challenge off name into, which was Duel. And we're like, well, this is perfect. This is where it is. And we had a bit of an algorithm that can allow you to rank content in a head-to-head manner. And so we kind of combined a bunch of these things, but mainly the premise was, how do we solve that problem? But it turns out that it's a massive problem. This is why no one has solved it. And this was 2017, and we spent we attempted to build some things, tested it, sort of spoke to some brands, realized that we built the entirely wrong thing, and then decided, well, let's just go back to the drawing board and speak to as many brands as possible to find out what problem they've got. And now this is something which when you asked me the advice, I wish this is the thing that I did first, instead of 5 years later, which is sit down, talk to the buyer, the customer. And we offered a lot of free consulting. We had a gamification expertise, which was really useful and interesting. By that point, we'd kind of acquired some really talented brains. We had a consumer psychologist out of Cambridge's Mind Body Behavior Lab. We had Jack, who she was the GM of brand and community at Lululemon, who are, they're a $40 billion brand built purely on community. They've never spent a penny on ads. They are literally the pinnacle of this type of mindset, and when it comes to advocacy. And so we would go into some of these amazing brands, freely give ourselves out to support them with what we did. But all the time we were just getting this information about what they wanted, what they needed, what their tech stack was, and what it meant. And what we found from that process is that most brands, particularly the online ones, have 10, 12 different tools, disparately unconnected, all with their own kind of cost base, which meant that when you, like Dan, was to buy a product and then maybe leave a review and then maybe post about it to social and refer a friend and then give some feedback on its improvement, those things were all sitting in isolation. So actually rewarding and celebrating Dan as a top customer, as one of their advocates who's really supported them, was impossible. And so we set about building that platform, which had to be really quite broad, and it took quite a while for us to build. And eventually we put it first into beta towards the end of 2019.
Interesting. Yes. So what I noticed actually just from doing my kind of Googling you was there's a sort of, let's call it, they're called pivoting now, isn't it? There's sort of iterations of your business. Back when I was a lad, it was called shitting yourself because it wasn't working the way you thought it was going to work. But like pivoting. So you've had, so there's iterations of the focus of the company and the way to achieve that mission, I guess, this sort of tool or the platform or the proposition. So just looking back from where you are now, because you found this kind of the problem from speaking to customers, which is kind of, who knew? So looking back now, the sort of iterations of your business, what do you think you've learned from that experience? You said you would do things differently now, but what would you do? You're looking back at that 5-year period. What have you learned?
So I think we're a B2B SaaS company. Understanding who the target market is really, really hard. And something every SaaS company, B2B company will always struggle with, understanding what you say no to. Because what we found is that actually there's a real focus on revenue. And I think this is something which in the States you don't get quite as much. But in the UK, it's like, well, you won't be able to raise your next round unless you've got certain amounts of revenue and showing that you're making money. So you sort of hunt down the revenue, and then you'll basically take whatever anyone will give you, and you'll kind of, at that stage, you'll customize it to try and make it work. And that is really, really dangerous. And that was the first iteration why it failed. We were like, oh, this person will pay us for this, and this person will pay us for this. Let's do that. And we ended up going down a rabbit hole that actually didn't solve the problem that we set out to try and solve. But someone was going to pay us, and that's what was the most important thing. But it's not. The most important thing is solving the problem that you're trying to solve. And so I wish that we had just gone out and really tried to understand who we were selling to, what their problems were, how we would go out and solve those, and build for that, not build for whoever would pay us because they've got an idea and a vision. In marketing, in that world, it's very creative and opinion led. Someone's like, I want to do this campaign. Can you support it? It's like, well, no, but we kind of could if we do this and this and this, and they're going to pay us. And actually, that was a really toxic thing that we did. The second thing, actually, and this is a really valuable learning that we took, is that we managed to get on an accelerator with a very large, Oracle. So Oracle, the biggest software company in the world, they had an accelerator for startups, which again, this is a little bit like getting anointed on high. We were absolutely guaranteed Larry Ellison was going to give us a call and buy the whole stack for $1 trillion. And it ended up being, it almost killed the company. 15th time, but it almost killed the company, because what's really interesting about these big, when we were pre-product, really, let alone pre-product market fit. When you start talking to big partners, they have all the time in the world. And the thing that you don't have when you're starting a business is time. And so there's 130,000 employees at that company, and every single of them wants to talk to that sexy startup that's in their startup program. And so we would have all these incredible chats with these great people, which would basically get us closer towards the Larry Ellison giving us that call. And then know that it came to absolutely nothing. And to this day, I don't think we've ever met a client who is on any of the Oracle technology that we were talking with. They are so far removed from where like the innovative brands are, and that we are an innovative, marketing technology company. And so there was such a horrible mismatch, and that time wasted over a 6-month period. It felt good. It felt like we were doing all the important work. We were traveling to San Francisco to go to their conference and meeting important partnerships and things like that. But actually, the only job, I believe, that I wish I had known that a founder has got is to find product market fit. Nothing else matters. It's not about money. It's not about raising capital. It's not about partnerships. All those things will come later. You have to find the right market and you have to build the right product for that market. And until you've solved that, nothing else should distract you from it.
Yeah, it's very seductive saying you're flying to San Francisco.
Oh yeah, it felt great. Like Instagram photos. We ended up even meeting the big Lazar man himself. We had like cocktails in his $40 million house overlooking the San Francisco Bay. And it was, we were making it. This is what entrepreneurs should do. This is what founders do in startup land. And it was by far and away the worst thing that we could have been doing. We weren't keeping our eyes on finding product market fit. It's
so funny. Like it's again, part of the reason for my blow up was seduction to the sort of bullshit side, as it were. It's like the kind of it looks good on Instagram part of my life was greater than the really does my company stable at the moment bit. And to this point, it's often, again, it's such a damn cliche that it's who's the customer and what problem are you solving for them. But the reason it feels like a cliche because, it's new and emergent and I've got this new innovative technology. And what I was going to say actually is the whole problem about innovation and doing new stuff that's interesting and is new is the newsworthiness of it. Because I had this back in 2004, I co-founded with another podcast guest, actually, Martin Ware, who's on the podcast, who's a very well-established musician, a sonic branding agency. We were the world's first transatlantic sonic branding company. I had a guy in San Francisco, Noel, excellent chap. And we were doing projects all over the world, what have you, but everybody wanted to have a chat. And then, so we spent our entire time demoing stuff and chatting to big companies and brands all over the place, and nobody spent any money. And then it was like, guys, we kind of need to eat, you know what I mean? Like we like giving your marketing director a briefing. So there's a real risk here if you do create something new, it actually becomes a real quagmire because even if people are interested, you don't have the time to fund it, to the conversation.
Yeah, and it's really hard to say no. Really, really hard to say no. Like if a big fund calls you up, or like a big company, and it feels good, and they look kind of connected. I think the answer is like you will never say no to all the things you should say no to. But I think that what I've learned subsequently is that you can get benefit out of these conversations. And so most of the conversations that feel like they could go somewhere, if you just try and get one recommendation for a client, potentially, then that actually will make that conversation absolutely worthwhile. And so particularly if people are going to go through the funding cycle, think of what investors can do for you. And you're about to meet however many investors in those conversations. Only a small handful of them will ever invest, which means most of those conversations aren't going to go anywhere. But what you can do is that you can turn the tables in that conversation. You can say, well, actually, what we want are investors who are able to help us. Now, tell me, how do you think you can support us? How are you connected with insert target market here, or other investors who do this kind of thing? Whatever problems you're trying to do, whether you're trying to find customers or trying to find investment or whatever it is, you can always use and leapfrog. And actually, you'll find that those who are the ones who are the most generous with their time and their connection and their networks are actually exactly the ones that you want in your cap table, because they're the ones who can add the most value, and they are always going to be adding value there and will continue to, because it's so intuitive to those people as like natural networkers and people who give instead of take.
That's a good shout. That, yeah, and it's funny. This came up for my company this week. Well, it's definitely some people get what we do, some people don't, and the ones that get it really get it. And it's just like it's like a mindset, basically. There's people who get it and people who don't get it, and it's took me like 18 years. My company's 18 years old to get to this point where I'm like, oh yeah, like when we speak to people, I just need to look for the sort of twinkle in their eye and then double down on those people. But I love that thing about going in there with an intention to sort of ask. And perhaps it's easy when you're particularly starting out to get starry-eyed about a big investor or a big corporate or a famous entrepreneur, but to go in there with your own agenda and that intention to sort of how can you move what is your agenda? Firstly, it's good to understand that because often you don't. And then secondly, how do you drive that forward? That's really great. Okay, we're heading towards the sort of end of our podcast time. I'm going to ask you a question, which I like to ask entrepreneurs, because we're busy dishing out advice and there's lots of advice out there. But what advice should entrepreneurs ignore?
Oh, I think they should probably ignore all advice. The only thing you can take on board is shared experience, and that if someone has lived through it, they say, this is what I see. And I think every single person will experience things in different ways. So you've always got to take that with a pinch of salt. But when you're chatting to someone and they've experienced something similar to what you're going through, what you're doing, then that's something you should pay heed to. One of the most toxic things I think in the startup land is that there are a lot of people who find the whole scene very interesting and exciting. And, they may have been a tax partner at a big four accountancy firm, but they've got a bit of money in their pocket. And then they're going to say, I'm going to advise companies and these early startups. And anything that they tell you from an advisory position, unless they're talking about tax for a large multinational corporate, is probably going to be irrelevant, and you should ignore it. Relative to finding those people who've done what you are trying to do, listen to them, find out their pain points. Ideally, find someone who's done it twice, and that experience that you can kind of pull on there. So I'd say ignore all advice and only pay heed to experience.
Yeah, I love that. Ignore all advice. I'm going to on my merch T-shirt store, which doesn't exist and may never exist. I'm going to have
but
that.
It should.
it should say "Ignore all advice," by Paul Archer, and then that'll be my best-selling T-shirt on the forthcoming podcast merch store.
Can't wait. I'm going to say, hopefully I get some of the proceeds, and
obviously, we were negotiating hard with my legal team, whatever. No, we won't. I'm joking aside. I might do that one time. People keep coming out with really kind of like gems of quotes on this podcast, and I keep on jokingly saying I'm going to set up a merch store. Well, maybe we should. Yeah, maybe that's not a bad idea. Maybe that's now. I think I don't think I have mentioned you. You are our 50th interviewee. And so maybe we should take this seriously now. I've been doing it for a year and done it 50 times, and get a merch stall. That's what we need.
That's what grown-ups do.
That's what you've made it when you've got a podcast with merch.
Yeah, that is the dream. who needs like the private jets and the fancy conferences and stuff? You need a merch store. Yeah,
I'll cancel my meetings. Let the merch commence. Where can people find out more about you, Paul, and about your business and about what you're up to? I think it's you're doing some really interesting work, and you've got a great story. How can we find out more about you?
Yeah, absolutely. I think quite interesting. We talk very much about the sort of formative years of what we're doing, but Duel now is one of the leading brand advocacy platforms in the world, I guess, working with some of the biggest brands. You can name most of the big brands in the UK, so ASOS, Unilever, Beauty Pie, Monica Vinader, and a bunch more. So we work particularly well to support brands who are growing and scaling, or they're large. The larger you are, the bigger the problem is that we solve when it comes to actually growing through advocacy and either building communities of creators, or building communities of industry professionals, makeup artists, hairdressers. We do very well with that, or mountain guides and things like that. So they all use our platform to manage that. And so if you're a brand in that area, like, we can hopefully help you with that. But if you're an earlier stage brand, actually we put out quite a lot of content to sort of support in this idea of like building brand, because your brand is effectively your reputation. They are one and the same. They're synonymous in my mind, at least. And actually advocacy that comes from it is like spreading that around, trying to get it out there. And so that is the only thing that really matters when it comes to building a brand, particularly a kind of a consumer retail-y brand. And so, that's why I started the podcast, Building Brand Advocacy, chatting to founders of some of the most exciting and best brands in the country, and actually in the world, to learn their stories about how they did it and what the kind of counterintuitive elements that found them, like, how did I invest in that particular thing here that I knew would build our reputation as being particularly special. And so that's it. So you can search for that on all of the good podcasting things. And so there's some interviews there. It's relatively new. We only came out about a month ago, but we've got already about 5 episodes in, and some great guests like Dan Price from my first years. We had other guys from Olio as well. They should check out that. That's a fantastic business and a great community. So that's one thing. If I can help anyone at all earlier in their kind of journey, whether you're a brand or whether you're trying to build a SaaS sort of platform, like, I'm trying to help and give that some time. And so I have some sort of office hours that I'm using to sort of support the community and people, so they can learn from my experiences and mistakes that I've made going forward with it. So drop me an email. My email is Duel, DUEL.tech, TECH. So Paul@duel.tech. And I will endeavor to respond back in a almost timely manner.
There we go. That's all we can ever hope to be. Almost timely.
Almost timely.
Yeah, well, there you go. Well, yeah, no, I'll definitely check it out. It's great content on the Duel website, on the blog, and I have been listening actually to the Olio episode and others of building brand advocacy. So I highly recommend it. So do check it out. We'll put all those links in the notes. So follow those. And well, what I've been really, thank you for sharing so openly. It's been really great to hear the story. I love kind of the spirit of entrepreneurship and adventure that you've got, and so thank you so much, and thanks for coming, everybody, and I'll see you all next time.
Thanks, Dan. Love the podcast. Keep it up.
Do you want to get the top 5 tidbits from each episode emailed to your inbox every Friday? Yes, you do. It saves you having to go through and make notes and make a note of all the books and all the ideas that are in the podcast. We go through and we choose the top 5 we like, plus put all the links into that email. So if you just go up to honeyiblewupthebusiness.com, yes, that's honeyiblewupthebusiness.com, and just enter your email address. There's a little box, just enter it in, and we will send you that information. And it saves you having to make notes and all that. That's make your life a bit easier. And of course, if you did enjoy the episode, please consider subscribing. We are trying to help people through this. So the more people that subscribe, review, rate on Apple, Google Podcasts, Spotify, the more people will see it and the more we can help. So help us, help other people, other entrepreneurs like you. And before I go, I've got to say big up to my company, the tech department, the company we blew up and put back together again. They're generously supporting me on this mission through the podcast. So if you guys want to have a look at a company that can really help you improve your technology, make it better so your business gets better too, boosting your sales and your profit and a bit more sanity in your life, a little less stress, then head up to thetechdept.com, the tech department. My company, give us a look. On behalf of all of us here, thank you for listening, and I'll see you next time.